My family divided my $4 million assets without telling me. They didn't know I was watching everything. It started with a spreadsheet. Not just any spreadsheet, mind you. This was a carefully curated, meticulously updated document I'd been maintaining for years, a digital fortress guarding every single dollar, every single stock, every single property that made up my father's legacy. $4 million. It sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's also a number that can disappear like smoke if you weren't paying attention. And I had been paying attention, more than anyone in my family gave me credit for. Dad died suddenly, a massive heart attack while on a fishing trip in Montana. One minute he was laughing, reeling in what he swore was a record-breaking trout. The next, gone. The shockwave of it rippled through us all, but for me, it was more than just grief. It was a gnawing unease, a premonition that the careful order he'd built might not survive his absence. He'd always been the steady hand, the one who balanced the books, the one who remembered to pay the property taxes on the lake house, the one who made sure my younger brother Mark didn't blow through his trust fund on Bitcoin futures before he was 30. Mom, bless her heart, was a wreck. She'd always deferred to Dad on financial matters, happy to manage the household and the garden, leaving the serious stuff to him. I, on the other hand, had always been drawn to the numbers. I'd interned at an investment bank during college, even considered a career in finance before I pivoted to landscape architecture. But the discipline, the analytical mindset, that stayed with me. I was the responsible one, the one who actually read the annual reports Dad sent out, the one who asked questions about diversification. Mark was Mark. Charismatic, charming, a born salesman who always seemed to land on his feet, but his relationship with money was casual, generous to a fault, often impulsive, always believing the next big deal was just around the corner. When Dad's will was read, it was surprisingly straightforward. Everything split evenly between Mom, Mark, and me. No complicated trusts, no stipulations beyond the basic ones for Mark's inheritance, which were more about protection than outright control. I thought, okay, this is manageable. We'll work through it. We'll honor Dad's memory by being smart with what he left us. I was wrong. The first sign something was off was the lack of communication. After the funeral, after the casserole stopped arriving and the condolences faded, things went quiet. Not just the usual post-grief lull, but a deliberate, almost eerie silence when it came to the estate. Mom was still lost in her sorrow, understandably. Mark was already talking about selling Dad's old truck to fund a business venture he vaguely described as disruptive tech. I tried to initiate conversations. I'd call Mom, ask if she'd heard anything about the probate lawyer, about the accounts being settled. She'd just sigh and say, "Oh, I don't know, honey. Your brother is handling some of that. You should talk to him." So I talked to Mark, and his answers were always evasive. Yeah, things are moving, Sarah. Lawyers, you know how it is. Bureaucracy. Don't worry your pretty little head about it. Just focus on your beautiful garden designs. The condescension, that was new. Dad always respected my insights.
Mark, though, he treated me like I was still the little sister who needed his protection, a role I'd outgrown 20 years ago. Then came the holiday season. Thanksgiving. We always gathered at the family home, the sprawling colonial in Connecticut Dad had poured his heart into. This year, though, felt different. Mom was still fragile, but there was a tension in the air, a palpable awkwardness that hung heavier than the scent of roasted turkey. Mark arrived late, looking impossibly polished, with his new girlfriend, Tiffany, a woman with a laugh that could curdle milk and eyes that constantly scanned the room, assessing its value. During dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to Dad's estate. Mom, pushing a stray piece of stuffing around her plate, finally voiced her worry. "Sarah, I just don't understand why we haven't heard anything concrete. Mark, you said you were talking to the lawyer about the investments." Mark waved a dismissive hand. "Mom, it's all taken care of, really. I've been streamlining things, making sure everything is set up optimally for all of us." "Optimally?" I interjected, my fork stopping halfway to my mouth. "What exactly does that mean, Mark? Have the assets been distributed? Have we received statements?" He shot me a look, a flash of something I couldn't quite place. Annoyance? Guilt? "Sarah, you're always so focused on the details. It's complicated. There were adjustments needed. Dad's portfolio wasn't quite as liquid as we thought. Some restructuring was necessary." "Restructuring?" My voice was rising, sharper than I intended. "Without consulting me? Without consulting Mom?" Tiffany, who had been silently observing with a detached amusement, finally spoke, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Oh, darling, it's just so stressful, isn't it? Mark has been working incredibly hard to sort everything out. He's been so selfless, really, trying to protect you both from all the unpleasantness." The unpleasantness, that's what they were calling it. I felt a cold dread begin to seep into my stomach. I excused myself, claiming I needed to check on something in the kitchen, and retreated to the quiet pantry. I pulled out my phone. my fingers shaking slightly as I opened my secure cloud storage. I navigated to the spreadsheet, the one that was supposed to be my secret weapon, my reference point. And that's when the numbers stopped matching. Not drastically at first. A few thousand here, a few hundred there. Small discrepancies easily dismissed as administrative errors, rounding issues. But they were persistent, and they were growing. I cross-referenced the account numbers, dividend payouts, stock splits, everything I had meticulously logged, and with each check, the disparity widened. My initial thought was that perhaps Dad had made some last-minute changes I wasn't aware of, but the timeline didn't fit. The discrepancy started appearing just weeks after his death, before anything could have possibly been legally or financially altered without our knowledge. I spent the rest of the evening in a daze, picking up my food, nodding numbly to conversations I barely registered. The image of my spreadsheet, once a symbol of control and clarity, now felt like a mocking testament to my own naivete. I had trusted them. I had trusted my mother, my brother. I had assumed that in the face of shared grief, our family would pull together. I had been a fool.
The next morning, I drove back to my apartment in the city, the hollowness in my chest growing with every mile. I didn't call anyone. I didn't explain my abrupt departure. I just needed to be alone. Alone with my thoughts, alone with the gnawing suspicion that was rapidly solidifying into a horrifying certainty. For the next few weeks, I played the part of the grieving daughter, the dutiful sister. I'd call Mom, listen patiently to her stories about Dad, about how much she missed him. I'd have brief, stilted conversations with Mark, mostly about mundane things, carefully avoiding any mention of the estate. But behind the facade, I was working. I started with the basics. I pulled my own financial records, my tax returns, anything that might shed light on how Dad's assets were structured. I contacted a few trusted colleagues from my internship days, asking for advice on how to discreetly investigate the handling of an estate, especially if foul play was suspected. They were hesitant, rightfully so, but they pointed me towards resources, legal avenues, and the importance of irrefutable proof. My spreadsheet was my starting point, but it wasn't enough. It showed my understanding of the assets, but it didn't provide the concrete evidence of their actions. I needed to see the transactions. I needed to see the paperwork. This is where the watching everything part came in. Dad, bless his meticulous soul, had been a creature of habit. He'd kept copies of everything, and he'd had a system, a very old-fashioned paper-based system, stored in the dusty attic of the Connecticut house. I knew that system well. I'd helped him organize it years ago. Mark and Mom, in their grief and their perceived competence, had overlooked the most obvious source of information. They assumed that because Dad was gone, his meticulously kept records would simply remain there, undisturbed, until they decided to deal with them properly. They didn't account for the fact that I, Sarah, the quiet landscape architect, was the only one who truly understood the depth of his organization, the breadth of his foresight. Under the guise of clearing out some of Dad's old things to make Mom feel better, I made a trip back to Connecticut. I told Mark I was going to sort through some of Dad's old gardening books and tools. He shrugged. Sure, whatever. Just don't start a bonfire, okay? He was so dismissive, so utterly convinced of his own control. The attic was exactly as I remembered it. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light filtering through a grimy window. The air was thick with the smell of aged paper and forgotten memories. Boxes were stacked neatly, labeled with Dad's precise handwriting. Property deeds, tax returns 1990 to 2000, investment statements. I spent 2 days up there, working through the boxes, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a growing sense of purpose. I found the original investment portfolio summaries, the brokerage statements, the deeds to the properties, even the paperwork for the life insurance policies. I scanned everything. Every page, every signature, every number. I used a portable scanner I'd bought specifically for this purpose, loading the files onto a secure encrypted USB drive. As I scanned, the discrepancies became starkly clear. Dates of transfers, beneficiary changes, sales of assets that I had no record of, and crucially, documents showing the creation of new holding companies, entities I'd never heard of, whose beneficiaries were not me, not Mom, but a name that sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Tiffany. Tiffany. Mark's girlfriend. The woman who had looked at me with those calculating eyes at Thanksgiving. The woman who had been so quick to praise Mark's selflessness. She wasn't just a girlfriend. She was a partner in their quiet heist. My hands were covered in dust. My clothes smelled of mildew, and my eyes burned from the strain of reading tiny print in dim light. But as I packed up the scanner and the USB drive, A different kind of fire was burning within me. It wasn't the grief for my father anymore. It was a cold, hard rage. A rage that was starting to crystallize into a plan. I drove away from the house, leaving it as it was, as if I hadn't disturbed a single cobweb. The world outside seemed oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred within me. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that felt like they were stretching out from the secrets I had unearthed. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was just the beginning. They had taken what was mine, what was rightfully mine and my mother's, believing they were untouchable. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated the quiet one, the one who watched, the one who remembered. And they would soon learn that the greatest betrayals don't always come with a bang, but with the silent, relentless turning of pages, the careful counting of every single dollar, and a reckoning that was long overdue. The next step was not about regaining what was lost, but about ensuring they never had the chance to do it again, to anyone. And the thought of their faces when they realized just how thoroughly they had miscalculated, that was a prospect that filled me with a strange, dark satisfaction. This was no longer about grief. It was about justice, and I intended to deliver it with the precision of a master architect, building a structure of retribution brick by meticulous, undeniable brick. The drive back to the city was a blur of adrenaline and a simmering, controlled fury. The USB drive felt like a lead weight in my pocket, a tangible testament to the elaborate deceit. For days, I'd lived in a fog of shock and disbelief. Now, that fog had burned off, leaving behind a landscape of cold, hard resolve. I spent hours in my apartment, the lights off, the city's hum a distant drone, poring over the scanned documents. The names of the shell corporations, the intricate web of transfers, the dates, they all pointed to a calculated plan, executed with a chilling efficiency. It wasn't just about taking money. It was about erasing my father's legacy, and by extension, my place within it. Mark, my charming, supposedly hapless brother, was the architect of this betrayal, and Tiffany, his ambitious consort, was his eager accomplice. The most damning evidence wasn't just the missing funds, but the clear beneficiaries designated on multiple key accounts. Tiffany's name, listed as the sole recipient on investments that should have been split 3 ways. It was a slap in the face, a declaration that I, his daughter, his blood, was less valuable than a woman he'd met maybe a year ago. The thought of my mother, so fragile and lost, being a pawn in their game, a victim of their avarice while they feigned concern, fueled my resentment further. They saw her as a grieving widow, easily manipulated. They saw me as the overlooked, overly analytical sister, too caught up in my gardens to understand the real world. They were about to learn just how real the real world could get. I began to map it out, not with the emotional urgency of a victim, but with the strategic detachment of a chess player. I needed to understand the full scope of their manipulation before I made a single move. My father's spreadsheet, once a source of comfort and clarity, was now my blueprint for their downfall. I started cross-referencing my original data with the newly acquired documents, creating a parallel document, an echo of theirs, but this one was mine, and it detailed every illicit transaction, every hidden account, every undeclared asset. I built a timeline of their actions, starting from the week after Dad's death. The dates of the transfers, the establishment of the offshore accounts, the creation of the trust for Tiffany, it was all there, laid bare. The speed at which they'd moved, the audacity of it, was staggering. They were so confident in their anonymity, so sure that no one would look too closely, or that if they did, they wouldn't have the knowledge or the nerve to challenge them. One particularly egregious entry caught my eye. A significant portion of Dad's portfolio, shares in a private tech company he'd invested in years ago, had been sold off almost immediately. The buyer wasn't a traditional investment firm. It was a company registered in the Cayman Islands, a common front for discrete transactions. And the sale price, according to the brokerage statement I'd scanned, was significantly below its estimated market value. This wasn't just about siphoning off funds. It was about liquidating assets quickly and quietly, likely to obscure their true worth and make them harder to trace. The proceeds, I suspected, had been channeled into accounts controlled by Mark and Tiffany, likely through a series of increasingly complex international transfers designed to break the audit trail. It was a sophisticated move, one that suggested they had help, perhaps from a crooked financial advisor or a lawyer with a flexible moral compass. The thought made my blood run cold. They weren't just greedy, they were calculating, and quite possibly operating with professional assistance. I spent another week buried in research, devouring articles on asset tracing, international finance law, and the legal implications of inheritance fraud. I learned about discovery processes, the powers of subpoena, and the forensic accounting methods used to unravel complex financial schemes. The more I learned, the more the scope of their deception became apparent. It wasn't just about the initial inheritance, it was about every cent my father had worked for. They were systematically dismantling his life's work and appropriating it for themselves. My mother called during this time. Her voice, usually a soft melody, was now laced with a weariness that tore at me. "Sarah, honey, are you all right? You've been so quiet. Mark says you're stressed about work, but..." She trailed off, her unspoken concern hanging heavy in the air. I forced a smile into my voice. "I'm fine, Mom, just a demanding project. You know how it is." I couldn't tell her. Not yet.
How could I explain this to her, this betrayal by her own son, without shattering her already fragile world? She was grieving, and this would crush her. I had to wait for the right moment, when I had irrefutable proof, when I could present it to her not as an accusation, but as a devastating truth she deserved to know. Mark, meanwhile, was becoming more brazen. He started calling me, his tone shifting from dismissive to demanding. "Sarah, we need to discuss liquidating some of Dad's assets. Mom's getting anxious and we need to settle things. I was thinking of the lake house. It's just sitting there, costing us money. We could get a good price for it." The lake house. Dad's sanctuary. A place of quiet contemplation, filled with memories of childhood summers and shared laughter. The idea of Mark and Tiffany selling it off, turning it into a sterile rental property or a soulless vacation home, made my stomach churn. He was testing the waters, seeing if I would object. He was assuming I was still the passive sister, easily swayed by his charm and his pronouncements of financial strategy. The lake house? I kept my voice neutral, a careful veil over the storm raging inside. "I don't know, Mark. It's a big decision. Dad loved that place. Have you even talked to Mom about it, seriously?" "Of course I have," he lied smoothly, his voice laced with impatience. "She agrees it's a good idea. We just need your sign-off. The market's hot right now, Sarah. We don't want to miss this opportunity." The opportunity. Their perpetual excuse. I almost laughed. "I need more time to think about it, Mark. It's not just about the market. It's sentimental," he sighed, a theatrical display of exasperation. "Sarah, seriously? Sentiment doesn't pay the bills, and Mom needs the money. You want her to be comfortable, don't you?" The guilt trip. Classic Mark. He always knew exactly which buttons to push. "I'll consider it," I said, my voice firm, though I knew I wouldn't. Not ever. The lake house was a symbol, a representation of everything they were trying to erase. It held too much of Dad's essence to be carelessly discarded. The turning point, the moment the power truly began to shift, wasn't a grand revelation, but a quiet discovery hidden within the scanned documents. Amidst the brokerage statements and corporate filings, I found a series of encrypted emails. My father, a man of routine, had always been diligent about his digital security. He'd used a secondary email account for his more sensitive financial dealings, protected by a strong password. I remembered him mentioning it once, a throwaway comment about keeping his real work separate. Accessing it was a challenge, but armed with my knowledge of his habits and a few educated guesses based on significant dates in his life, I managed to crack the password. The contents of that inbox were a revelation. They weren't just emails, they were a detailed account of my father's growing suspicions about Mark's financial recklessness. There were exchanges with his lawyer, expressing concern about Mark's tendency to over-leverage his trust fund, even exploring options to safeguard future inheritances. There were correspondences with financial advisors, discussing strategies to protect the family's wealth from impulsive decisions. And then I found it. A series of emails, dated just months before his death, outlining his decision to establish a complex trust, designed to ensure that a significant portion of his estate would be managed independently, with independent oversight, precisely to prevent what Mark and Tiffany were now doing. He had seen this coming. He had anticipated this exact scenario. The emails explicitly stated that the terms of this trust were to be activated upon his death, with a designated trustee to oversee the distribution and management of specific assets.
The trustee was not family. It was a discreet, highly reputable financial management firm based in Chicago. And the initial documents for this trust, which Dad had drafted and had ready to be filed, were also in that encrypted folder. He had prepared for their greed. He had built a contingency, a safety net, that he believed would protect his legacy and his family. This wasn't just about finding proof of their wrongdoing. It was about discovering Dad's final, desperate attempt to shield us. It meant that the money they had already siphoned off, the assets they believed were safely theirs, were actually designated for this trust. They had acted with such haste, such arrogance, that they had moved to seize assets that were already earmarked for a more secure, more controlled future. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just stolen from me, they had stolen from my father's dying wishes. They had ignored his foresight, his love, his very clear intentions. The cold rage I had been nurturing began to transform into something even more potent, a righteous, unyielding determination. This wasn't just about reclaiming my inheritance. It was about honoring my father's last act of protection. I immediately contacted the financial management firm. I presented myself not as a grieving daughter seeking answers, but as the executor of a plan my father had put in place. I sent them the encrypted emails and the draft trust documents. I could hear the shift in their tone over the phone, from polite professional inquiry to urgent, focused attention, as they recognized the validity and the critical nature of the information I provided. They confirmed that my father had indeed initiated the process for establishing the trust, and while the formal filing had been delayed due to his unexpected passing, the intent and the preparatory documents were clear. They assured me that, given the evidence, they could initiate legal proceedings to freeze any assets traceable to the estate that had been improperly transferred. The power shift was no longer a subtle current. It was a tidal wave building on the horizon. I held the keys to Dad's final safeguard, the very mechanism he had put in place to counter exactly this kind of familial avarice. Mark and Tiffany had acted on their assumptions, their arrogance, and their blind greed, never imagining that their father, their benefactor, had anticipated their behavior and laid a trap. My next move had to be precise. I couldn't afford a misstep. I arranged a meeting with the managing partner of the Chicago firm, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Eleanor Vance. We met at her sterile, impeccably organized office, miles away from the emotional turmoil of my family home. I laid out the entire timeline, the scanned documents, the encrypted emails, my own spreadsheet meticulously detailing the discrepancies.
Eleanor listened intently, her gaze sharp and analytical, interjecting with precise questions that showed she understood the gravity of the situation. "He was a wise man, your father," she said, her voice low and steady after reviewing the evidence. "He saw this coming. The speed at which these transactions occurred after his death, it's frankly quite shocking, even for people with less than honorable intentions. They've been very careless, especially given the existence of this pre-existing trust." She explained the process. They would file an injunction to freeze the assets. They would initiate legal proceedings against Mark and Tiffany to recover the misappropriated funds. It would be a complex, potentially lengthy battle, but with the documentation I had, the odds were overwhelmingly in our favor. The funds would eventually be recovered and placed under the control of the independent trust, managed according to my father's wishes. The thought of their faces when they received the legal notices, when they realized their carefully constructed scheme was crumbling around them, was a grim satisfaction I held close. They had underestimated me, yes, but they had also underestimated my father's love and his foresight. They thought they were dealing with a grief-stricken daughter. They were about to face a guardian appointed by their deceased father, armed with the evidence of their betrayal. The confrontation I'd been dreading, but also anticipating, came sooner than I expected. I received a call from my mother. Her voice was tight, strained, laced with a fear I hadn't heard before. "Sarah, Mark, he's furious. He got some sort of legal notice. He said someone is accusing him and Tiffany of stealing from Dad's estate. He's asking questions about you. He thinks you're behind it." The trap had sprung. They had been served. The quiet architect had revealed herself, and the house of cards they'd built was about to collapse. My carefully constructed calm threatened to crack. I knew this moment would come, but hearing it, knowing the chaos it had unleashed, was a different kind of visceral shock. The wheels of justice, slow and deliberate, were in motion, and the full weight of my father's intent was about to bear down on Mark and Tiffany. The silence I had maintained, the quiet observation, was about to be shattered by the undeniable pronouncements of the law.
I was no longer just Sarah, the landscape architect. I was the executor of my father's final will, the guardian of his legacy, and the instrument of their reckoning. And as the phone line crackled with my mother's distressed questions, I knew that the true emotional confrontation, the one that would expose the depth of their betrayal and the extent of my father's love, was about to begin. The fight was far from over, but the tides had irrevocably turned. The air in the conference room was thick, not with the stale scent of old paper and cheap coffee, but with a palpable tension that hummed beneath the veneer of professional courtesy. Eleanor Vance sat across from me, her expression unreadable, as she meticulously reviewed the latest batch of documents I'd brought over. Sunlight, sharp and unforgiving, streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting stark shadows across the polished table.
This wasn't the hushed, emotionally charged environment of our family home. This was a battlefield, and every piece of paper was a weapon. The shell companies, Eleanor murmured, her finger tracing a line on a ledger. Clever, very clever. They thought they could hide it all in plain sight, funneling it through these offshore entities. But the dates, Sarah, the dates of transfer matched the liquidation of your father's private tech shares. It's all interconnected. She looked up, her eyes locking onto mine. And this purchase order for the vintage car, bought 3 days after your father's funeral, registered to a holding company in Panama, which, surprise, surprise, has ties back to Mark's business ventures. My breath hitched. The vintage car. Dad had always dreamed of restoring a classic Porsche, something he'd mentioned wistfully on several occasions, a distant, almost unattainable goal. The idea that Mark had used my father's money that should have been part of a carefully managed estate, to indulge in such a frivolous, immediate purchase felt like a physical blow. It was a statement, a declaration of ownership over something that wasn't his. They were so eager, I said, my voice barely a whisper, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the room, so sure that no one would ever look, or that if they did, they wouldn't have the tools to see it. Eleanor nodded, a slight tightening around her mouth. Greed often blinds people to the details. They focused on the destination, on the immediate gratification, and forgot about the journey. The audit trail, Sarah, it's always there if you know where to look. And your father gave us plenty of breadcrumbs. She tapped a document. These emails, they paint a picture of a man who deeply loved his family, but also recognized the flaws in his children. He foresaw this. He didn't trust Mark's judgment, and he certainly didn't trust Tiffany's influence. He knew, I said, the realization settling deeper into my bones, a heavy, cold weight. He knew Mark would try to take advantage. He just didn't know how far they'd go. He prepared for it, Eleanor corrected gently. This trust, his foresight, it's extraordinary. He essentially set up an independent entity to safeguard his legacy from his own family's impulsiveness. And you, Sarah, you've stepped into his shoes perfectly. You didn't just bring us evidence, you brought us his intent. The legal team is already moving to freeze all assets linked to Mark and Tiffany that can be traced back to your father's estate. The vintage car, the offshore accounts, the initial liquidation of the tech shares, it's all on hold. On hold. The words hung in the air, a quiet pronouncement of doom for them, a moment of profound relief for me. It wasn't the explosive, cathartic revenge I might have imagined in my darkest moments, but it was a surgical precision, a calculated dismantling of their illicit gains. The thought of Mark and Tiffany, so smug and self-assured just weeks ago, now facing legal injunctions, financial paralysis, it was a chilling vindication. What about Mom? I asked, my voice cracking slightly. The concern for her, for how she would process this, was a constant ache. The injunction will prevent any immediate liquidation of assets that could impact the estate's value.
We've also sent a preliminary notification to our legal counsel, explaining that an independent trust has been activated to manage certain assets as per your father's wishes. We're trying to shield her from the direct conflict as much as possible, but the reality of Mark's actions, that's something she'll have to confront. Eleanor's gaze softened. Grief is a powerful, unpredictable force, Sarah. It can make people vulnerable. Your brother and his wife exploited that vulnerability. But your father's plan, it's designed to protect her, ultimately, to ensure she has security, regardless of what happened. The next few days were a strange mixture of controlled chaos and unnerving quiet. The legal notices had been served. The immediate fallout was a storm of calls, texts, and increasingly frantic voicemails from Mark.
He was cycling through denial, anger, and a pathetic attempt at negotiation. He claimed he was being framed, that there must be a mistake, that I was overreacting, that I was jeopardizing Mom's future. His words, once a weapon, now sounded like the desperate flailing of a drowning man. Tiffany remained silent. Her silence was more chilling than Mark's bluster. It spoke of a calculated understanding of the situation, a strategic retreat to assess the damage. I imagined her, somewhere, perhaps meticulously shredding documents, or already drafting new plans, her ambition unquenched, merely rerouted. Mom called, her voice a thin thread of distress. "Sarah, honey," Mark called. "He's so upset. He said you're trying to ruin him. He says Tiffany is devastated. And I don't understand what's happening. What is this about an estate? What are you doing?" The dam of my composure finally cracked. The carefully constructed facade of calm I had maintained for weeks began to crumble under the weight of her confusion and pain. "Mom," I started, my voice thick with unshed tears. It's not what you think. It's about Dad. About what he wanted." I sat her down in her familiar living room, the one filled with the scent of her potpourri and the comforting weight of her memories. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plush carpet, the same shadows that had always seemed to soften the edges of her worries. I didn't bring any documents, no legal jargon, just the truth. I told her about the USB drive, about the hidden accounts, about the shell corporations. I told her about the vintage car, about the tech shares, about the speed at which everything had been moved after Dad's death. Her face, usually so open and expressive, became a mask of disbelief. Her eyes, the same soft blue as mine, widened with a dawning horror. She reached for my hand, her grip trembling. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, Sarah. Mark wouldn't. Tiffany wouldn't. They loved your father. They wouldn't. They couldn't." "Mom," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Dad knew. He saw this coming. He was so worried about his impulsiveness. And Tiffany, she encouraged it. He set up a trust, Mom. A trust specifically to protect us from this. He knew if anything happened to him, they would try to take everything. He wanted to make sure you were safe. He wanted to make sure his legacy wasn't squandered." As I spoke, the images flooded back. Dad's worried frown when Mark had mentioned another investment opportunity, the way he gently steered conversations away from finances when Tiffany was present.
He hadn't been oblivious. He'd been observant. He had loved them, but he had also seen their flaws, their vulnerabilities, and the dangerous path they could lead. Her silence now was different from Mark's. It was a heavy, sorrowful silence, filled with the weight of a shattering realization. Her hand tightened on mine, her knuckles white. Her eyes, once filled with gentle concern, now held a deep, unfathomable sadness. She looked at the framed photos on the mantelpiece, Dad smiling, Mom radiant, a young Mark and me laughing. The image of her family, the one she held so dear, was being fractured before her very eyes. He trusted you," she finally said, her voice raw and broken. "He trusted you to do this, to protect us. He always said you were the steady one, the thoughtful one." She looked at me, her gaze searching, a flicker of something akin to pride mixed with profound grief. "And I didn't see it. I was so caught up in missing him. I didn't see what was happening." The confession, the raw confession of her own blindness, was more devastating than any confrontation. It was the final, silent acknowledgement of their betrayal, not just to me, but to her, to the memory of her husband. Later that week, the official paperwork arrived. Eleanor's team had been efficient and thorough. A formal notification detailing the legal action against Mark and Tiffany, the freezing of assets, and the activation of the independent trust. It was a document devoid of emotion, yet it carried the weight of undeniable truth. It stated in stark legal language that the actions taken by Mark and Tiffany were in direct violation of the wishes of the deceased, and that all misappropriated funds would be recovered and managed under the strict purview of the trust. I didn't need to confront them directly. The legal documents spoke for themselves. Mark's frantic calls ceased. Tiffany's silence continued, a heavy, ominous absence. The family group chat, once a constant stream of superficial updates and manufactured cheer, went dormant. The rift was too wide, the betrayal too profound to bridge with pleasantries. The lake house, Dad's sanctuary. It was safe. It would remain untouched, managed by the trust. The vintage car was impounded, a gleaming testament to their greed, waiting to be sold and returned to the estate. The tech shares, once so readily liquidated, were now under judicial review, their true value to be determined and recovered. They had tried to erase my father's legacy, to rewrite his story. Instead, they had become a footnote in it, a cautionary tale of avarice. I stood on my balcony, the city lights twinkling below like scattered diamonds. The cool night air brushed against my face, carrying with it the distant murmur of traffic, a constant reminder of the world that kept turning. There was no triumphant fanfare, no grand victory parade, just a quiet, profound sense of closure. The anger that had consumed me for weeks had finally subsided, replaced by a weary yet resolute peace. It wasn't about winning, it was about reclaiming. Reclaiming my father's legacy, reclaiming my own sense of self-worth that had been chipped away by their condescension and deceit. It was about honoring the man who had loved me enough to foresee my own destruction and build a shield for me, even in death. The journey had been brutal, marked by humiliation, betrayal, and the suffocating weight of familial deception. But I had navigated it.
I had found the strength within myself, a strength I hadn't known I possessed, to face the darkness and emerge into the light. The cost had been immense, the emotional scars deep, but standing here now, under the vast expanse of the night sky, I felt a profound sense of liberation. This was not an ending, but a new beginning, built on the ashes of their lies and the enduring foundation of my father's love. The quiet hum of the city felt like a lullaby, a gentle promise of a future I had fought for, a future where my own story, unburdened by their shadows, could finally begin to unfold.